I wasn't quite sure where to post these tales, so I figured I'd share them here. I've worked as a rescue man for many years now, and I've seen things that I think you'll find interesting. I'm pretty good at finding missing people, if I do say so myself. Most folks simply lose their way, straying off the path, stumbling down a slope, and then never finding the way back. They say, stay where you are, and most of the time that works out fine. But there have been 2 cases where that rule didn't hold, and we never found the missing person. Those cases still haunt me, and they drive me to search every case even more thoroughly to this day. It all began with a day of berry picking. A little boy was out with his parents, and he'd been playing alongside his older sister. In just a few seconds, the parents lost sight of both children, and before anyone knew what was happening, they'd simply vanished. Parents looked for a while on their own, but when they couldn't find any trace, they called us in to search the area. We found the daughter quite quickly. When we asked her where her brother was, she said something I'll never forget. She explained that her brother had been taken by the bear man. According to her, the bear man had offered her some berries and told her she had to stay completely still because he wanted to play with her brother. The last thing she remembered was seeing him perched on the man's shoulders as they wandered off into the thick forest. First, we assumed he'd been kidnapped by someone, but no sign of another person was ever found in that area. The description was chilling. A man, impossibly tall, his entire body covered in thick, dark hair like that of a bear, and a face that was strange and unsettling. We searched for weeks, the longest case of my career, and never found a single trace of that boy. Another case involved a young woman who had been hiking with her mother and grandfather. According to her mother, the girl had climbed a tree to get a better view of the forest, but she never came down. Both her mother and grandfather clearly saw her start climbing, but as she ascended into the dense canopy the higher she got, she slowly faded from view. Eventually, her voice fell silent, and they assumed she had simply settled in to enjoy the view from the top. They waited at the bottom for 3 hours, calling her name until finally, desperate, they rang for help. We scoured the area, but there was no sign of her. Neither the mother nor the grandfather ever saw her descend. In the end, the young woman was never found. I was once sent out to search for a man who hadn't returned on time after a climbing trip. We had to scramble up a steep slope, and fortunately, my colleagues and I soon found him wedged in a crevasse. He lay there, pale and terrified, with a broken leg, a gruesome open fracture with bone protruding through the skin. He had been trapped for nearly 2 days, and the wound was clearly infected. We managed to pull him out in relatively good shape, though there wasn't much we could do about his pain. As he lay on the stretcher waiting for the ambulance helicopter, his eyes locked on me. His mouth moved as though he was trying to tell me something, but his voice was so faint I couldn't decipher his words. His pallor made him look almost dead. Later, the rescue crew confided that he had been truly terrified. He told them that during the climb he'd been fine until he reached the summit, and then he saw another man. This other man was not equipped for climbing. He wore nothing more than a parka and ski pants. Climber explained that the stranger had approached him for a polite chat, since there were only the 2 of them up there. But when the stranger turned, the climber was struck with horror. The man had no face at all. It was as if his features had been erased, a vast, empty void where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, fixated on him. Panicked, the climber tried to retreat, stumbling backward as the faceless figure advanced slowly. That very moment led to his fall into the crevasse. For several minutes, a span I can't even recall exactly, the faceless stranger just watched him. Then he vanished. But that wasn't the end. The climber later told us he could hear the sound of those inhuman steps, climbing up and down the mountain all through the night, punctuated by muffled, dreadful screams. That memory still haunts me. One of the most disturbing experiences I've had happened when we were searching for a young woman who had separated from her hiking group. The dog scent hadn't faded, so we thought it safe to stop and search. Thankfully, we found her. She was lying by what looked like a rotten log. Strangely, she wasn't wearing her backpack or shoes, and she lay completely still, almost as if in a trance. First, we couldn't make contact, but eventually my colleagues managed to rouse her, and we got her back on her feet. Together, we made our way back to base. On the way, she kept glancing over her shoulder. In a trembling, almost whispery voice, she asked, "Why is that big man in the black coat following us?" We assumed it was just shock. But as we neared a rise in the land, her agitation grew. I began to suspect that she wasn't simply scared, it was something else. More than once, I ordered the man behind us to stop trying to scare her. At one point, she suddenly halted, turned around, and started screaming at the forest, demanding that he leave her alone, that she wasn't going with him. As we finally persuaded her to continue, strange sounds echoed from the surrounding woods, a sort of rasping cough, darker and more rhythmic than any natural noise. I can't quite explain it. When we reached the edge of our base, the woman turned to me as one of her companions remarked something about this one being on my shoulder. Then, in a low, urgent tone, she said, "I must ask you to hurry, he doesn't like necks." I froze. Somehow, she knew about the little scar I have at the base of my neck, a mark normally hidden by my shirt collar. No sooner had she said it than I heard that eerie coughing again right by my ear. I jumped, convinced someone stood right beside me, yet I saw nothing but the woman, my colleague, and myself on that desolate forest road. As dusk fell, we took her into the cabin where our offices are located. I did my best to hide how frightened I was. While we waited for the ambulance to examine her, she peered out the window into the bleak evening. Then, in a trembling voice, she whispered, "The man with the black eyes is standing outside, waiting for you." Few things in this line of work are as heartbreaking as missing children. No matter the circumstances, it's always a grim affair if we later discover a child dead. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it leaves its mark. I've seen cases where children ended up in places where they shouldn't have been, and one particular case still makes my blood run cold. A mother had taken her 3 children, one aged 6, one 5, and little Marit, just 3, on a picnic near a small lake. She claimed she never lost sight of them, and aside from the family, no one else was in the area. After the picnic, the family packed up and walked toward the parking lot. The lake lay about 3 kilometers into the forest, along a wide, well-trodden path where getting lost should be nearly impossible if you stick to the trail. Children led the way. Suddenly, the mother heard footsteps behind her, someone walking right there on the path. She turned, and in the few seconds her attention wavered, her 5-year-old son vanished. First, she assumed he had simply stepped off to relieve himself. When she asked the other 2 children, their frightened voices told her a different story. A tall man with a creepy face had emerged from the woods, grabbed her little son's hand, and led him off the path and into the forest. Panicked, the mother searched frantically, calling his name until, for a brief moment, she thought she heard him answer. Terrified of venturing into the forest with her other children, she called us immediately. We scoured kilometers of wilderness but found no trace, no scent for the dogs, no dropped clothes, nothing that a child had been there. For a time, suspicions even fell on the mother, though it was clear she was utterly devastated by what had happened. We searched for weeks with the help of numerous volunteers. Eventually, we had to close the case. Then one day, a radio message came in. A dead child had been found and needed to be collected. We couldn't believe our ears. We drove out about 24 kilometers from where the boy had vanished, and to our horror, it turned out to be the very boy we'd been searching for. I've mulled over how he ended up there. He was found intact, no injuries, no scratches. His shoes were gone, yet his feet were unscathed and clean. The cliff he was found at was steep and rugged, impossible for a 5-year-old to have climbed on his own. I'm convinced something larger and stronger must have carried him up there. Strangely, although he'd been in the forest for nearly a month, he only appeared to have been dead for a day or 2. We eventually concluded that he'd frozen to death, probably late one night, just 2 days before we discovered him. I still wonder what force in these woods could be responsible. One of my very first assignments as an apprentice was searching for a 4-year-old who had gotten separated from his mother. I knew we'd find him. Our dogs picked up his scent and we tracked his footprints. Sure enough, we found him in a clearing about a kilometer from where he was last seen. The boy had no idea he'd wandered so far, and one of the veteran rescuers took him back. I was secretly relieved. I've never been very good with kids, finding it hard to talk to them or keep them company. On our way back, my boss decided to take a detour and show me one of the most common places where we find missing persons. There's a natural little valley near a popular trail, just a couple of kilometers off the beaten path. We arrived in about an hour, and as we walked around, she pointed out spots where people had been found. Then, not far from there, about 13 kilometers from the parking lot, you can access some small tracks that lead deeper into the forest if you don't want to stray too far. That day we were on protected land, meaning no new buildings or commercial development were allowed. Only fire watchtowers or old abandoned houses, sometimes over 100 years old. From where I stood, I saw something that didn't belong. I told my superior, but she just shrugged and kept quiet. Staying a few meters behind, I moved in to investigate. When she was about 5 meters away, I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. There, right in the middle of the forest, was a staircase. 10 steps covered with a cream-colored carpet, an ordinary staircase you'd expect inside a house, not deep in the woods. The sides of the steps, however, were bare wood, as if the carpet hadn't been extended to cover them. It was like a glitch in a video game where the building never loads properly and only the stairs remain visible. I stood there, my mind racing to understand what I was seeing. My boss came over and calmly stood by my side, gazing at the staircase as if it were the most mundane thing in the world. I asked her what it was doing here in the middle of the forest. She shook her head and said, "You'll get used to it, you'll see many of them." As I tried to step closer, she gripped my arm firmly. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she warned in a quiet but insistent tone. "You'll see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them. Just ignore them." I wanted to ask more, but something in her expression told me to keep my questions to myself. Since then, on about every 5th assignment I've been on, I've come across one of these mysterious staircases. Sometimes they're just 3-4 kilometers away, other times 30-50 kilometers out in the middle of nowhere. They come in all shapes and sizes. The largest I've seen looked like it belonged to a grand mansion from the early 1900s, at least 3 meters wide and stretching 56 meters upward. I've tried asking around about them, but everyone gives me the same answer as my boss. They're completely normal. You don't need to worry about them, just don't go near. And that's what I tell new trainees to this day. I still hope that someday I'll get a better explanation, but as of now, I haven't.
That's it for tonight's tale. But don't worry, there's always more where that came from. Be sure to stay tuned for even more nerve-thrilling horror stories every single week. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join us here at the Hollow Horror. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Until then, stay safe. Or stay scared. See you next time.